The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl's screams into an abandoned fuel depot, and his wrath burned through the walls. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a night like any other when Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels biker with decades of road experience, was cruising the empty highway in the dead of night. His bike, a roaring beast with chrome pipes that sent echoes across the deserted landscape, was his only company. The air was cold, biting at his skin as the miles passed by beneath his tires. He had no particular destination, just the open road, the wind, and the freedom that came with it. That was until he heard it. A scream. It was high-pitched, desperate, and it shattered the calm of the night. It wasn't the sound of a woman or a man. It was the scream of a child. He slammed on the brakes, the motorcycle screeching as he skidded to a stop on the gravel shoulder of the road. His eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source. In the distance, he saw the faint glow of what looked like an abandoned fuel depot, its dilapidated structure barely standing under the weight of years of neglect. The scream came again, this time more frantic, echoing through the air like a call for help that could not be ignored. Reaper's heart pounded in his chest as he revved his engine and sped towards the sound. His years as a Hells Angels enforcer had taught him to ignore weakness, to never be swayed by emotions. But tonight, something was different. As he neared the depot, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The place was eerily silent now, no sign of life, just the wind whispering through the broken windows. The rusting metal and crumbling walls loomed like sentinels, guarding a dark secret. The only sound was the faint whimpering of the child, coming from somewhere inside. Jake dismounted, his boots hitting the ground. With a heavy thud, he drew his knife from its sheath, the cold steel gleaming under the dim light of the moon. His leather jacket creaked as he moved towards the entrance, his senses on high alert. His hand rested on the door handle, the metal cold and weathered, just like the place. With a quick yank, the door creaked open, revealing the inside of the abandoned depot. The dim light from the outside barely illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the cracked floor. And then he saw her. The little girl, no older than 10, was backed into a corner, her eyes wide with fear as she looked up at him. Her clothes were torn, dirt smeared across her face, and her small body trembled as she cowered in the corner. The sight hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't just any child. She was terrified, and it was clear she had nowhere to run. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered, a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake froze. His instinct was to push forward, to finish what he had come here to do. But this was different. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a criminal or a rival. She was just a scared little girl, lost in the chaos of a world that had no place for her. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He lowered his weapon, taking a step towards her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. The little girl looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope. She didn't move at first, as if afraid that even the slightest motion might provoke him. But when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, she finally let out a shaky breath, her body sagging in relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who would do this to a child? What kind of person could leave a little girl alone in a place like this? His jaw clenched, his anger rising again. But this time, it wasn't aimed at the child. It was aimed at whoever had done this to her. He crouched down to her level, his large frame intimidating but his voice calm. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here." Jake carefully helped the little girl to her feet, making sure not to startle her further. His large hands were surprisingly gentle as he steadied her, and for the first time since he entered the depot, the tension in his chest began to ease. The girl, who had been trembling just moments before, now looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. She was still frightened, but there was something in Jake's demeanor that made her feel safe. He took a deep breath, looking around the old fuel depot, its broken windows and rusting pipes echoing the years of neglect. It was a desolate place, and yet here, in the middle of nowhere, he had found her, alone, frightened, and vulnerable. He glanced back at the girl. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes still wide with fear. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, his expression softening. "All right, Emily. You're going to be okay. I'm going to get you out of here." He could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He wasn't used to comforting anyone, especially not a child, but something about the situation, something about Emily, made him want to protect her. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He gently took her hand, guiding her towards the back of the depot where his motorcycle was parked. The snow was falling harder now, swirling in the wind, but it was nothing compared to the cold Emily must have been feeling. As they approached the bike, Jake's thoughts raced. He needed to get her somewhere safe, away from whatever danger had brought her here. But he also had to make sure the area was clear. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. He mounted the motorcycle, patting the seat behind him. "Climb on," he said. Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded and carefully climbed onto the back of the bike. Jake started the engine, the roar of the motorcycle filling the empty night. As they rode through the dark streets, Jake couldn't help but keep an eye on his surroundings, scanning for any signs of danger. The further they got from the depot, the more the tension in his shoulders began to ease, but he remained on edge. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble Emily was running from, but he wasn't about to let it catch up to them. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. Jake pulled into the parking lot, turning off the engine. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll be right back." Emily nodded, her eyes still wide with uncertainty, but she didn't protest. Jake moved quickly, his boots clicking against the pavement as he made his way to the motel office. He needed a room for the night, somewhere Emily could rest and be safe while he figured out what to do next. The man behind the counter looked up as Jake approached. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice heavy with sleep. Jake slid a few bills across the counter. "I need a room," he said, his voice gruff. The man hesitated for a moment, looking Jake over, then nodded. "All right, you got it. Room 6. Jake took the key, nodding his thanks before returning to the bike. As he approached Emily, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she clutched the sleeves of her jacket as if she were trying to hold herself together. "Come on," Jake said, offering her his hand once again. "We'll get you settled inside." Inside the room, the air was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Jake helped Emily onto the bed, making sure she was comfortable before stepping back. He didn't know what to say, what to do next. His instincts as a biker told him to keep moving, to keep his distance, but something in him told him that he couldn't just leave her here, alone, vulnerable. He rubbed his face with one hand, trying to clear his mind. What was he supposed to do with a little girl? What was he supposed to do with himself, for that matter? The life he had led, full of violence, danger, and betrayal, felt so far removed from the quiet of this moment. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice softer now, more unsure than he had ever felt before. Emily nodded, and Jake stood up. "I'll be right back," he said, heading out the door to grab something to eat. As he walked to the small diner down the street, his mind raced. Who had left Emily alone in that fuel depot? Who had done this to her? The thought of anyone hurting a child like her filled him with rage, and he clenched his fists, trying to suppress the anger that was rising in his chest. But there was nothing he could do right now but get her food, get her safe. He wouldn't stop until he found the people responsible. When he returned with the food, he found Emily sitting on the bed, her face a little less tense, but still wary. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear, and for a moment, Jake wasn't sure what to say. He handed her the food. "Here," he said quietly. "Eat. You need to stay strong." She took it from him, her small hands trembling slightly as she accepted the meal. As she ate, Jake sat down on the chair by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside. The night was still, but his mind was anything but. He didn't know where this story would go, but one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving Emily behind. Not now, not ever. Jake spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching the snow fall gently outside, his thoughts heavy. Emily had finally fallen asleep, curled up on the bed, her exhaustion clear. He hadn't expected this. He had been ready for another night of solitude, a few hours on the road to forget the chaos that had defined his life. But now, here he was, responsible for a frightened little girl, her future uncertain, and her past filled with secrets that made his stomach turn. Who could do something like that to a child? The questions haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. But right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping Emily safe. He wasn't about to let whatever had chased her here find her again. The morning came quietly, the gray light filtering through the blinds as Jake stood up from the chair. His body was sore from the tension of the night, but he forced himself to stay focused. Emily was still asleep, but the soft rise and fall of her chest assured him she was at least resting. He quietly moved around the room, gathering his gear, preparing for whatever came next. As he stepped outside to check on his bike, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. It was still snowing, but the storm seemed to have calmed, leaving only a thick blanket of snow covering everything. The ground crunched beneath his boots as he walked over to his Harley. He checked it over quickly, making sure everything was in order. His mind, however, wasn't on the bike. It was on Emily. What had happened to her? How had she ended up in that fuel depot alone? And what kind of danger was she really in? He knew he couldn't stay in this motel forever, but the thought of going back to the road felt like a trap. There was something about Emily that made him want to protect her, something deeper than just the instinct to help a child. He'd seen a lot of ugly things in his life, more than most people would ever understand, and somehow, he felt like this was different. The urgency in her eyes, the fear in her voice, it all felt too real to ignore. Jake turned and walked back into the room, trying to push his thoughts aside. Emily was awake now, sitting up on the bed, rubbing her eyes as she looked around the room. She smiled weakly when she saw him. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, sitting down beside her. She nodded, though the hesitation in her eyes told him everything. She was still scared, still unsure. "I'm all right," she replied softly. Jake could tell it was a lie, but he didn't push her. "Not yet. I'm going to get you some breakfast, okay?" he said, standing up. "You stay here. I'll be back in a minute." He left the room and walked down the street to a small diner. The place was almost empty, with only a few truckers nursing coffee in the corner. He ordered 2 meals to go, the smell of eggs and bacon filling the air as he paid for the food. As he walked back to the motel, the weight of the day ahead pressed down on him. He didn't know where this was going. He didn't know how to fix whatever mess they were in. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her alone. When he returned to the room, he found Emily sitting at the small table, looking out the window. She was lost in thought, her tiny fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. Jake set the food down in front of her. "Here," he said, sitting down across from her. "Eat. You need to keep your strength up." Emily hesitated for a moment before picking up the fork, but she didn't eat right away. Instead, she stared at the plate, her eyes distant. "Jake?" she asked quietly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "What happened to me?" Her voice cracked, and for a moment, Jake saw the weight of her fear in her eyes. He didn't have an answer for her. He wished he did, but all he could do was promise her that he wouldn't let anything else happen to her. "You're safe now," he said, his voice firm. "No one is going to hurt you." Emily nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. He knew it would take time for her to trust him completely, but he wasn't going anywhere. After breakfast, Jake began making plans. He needed to find out who was after her and why. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had done this wasn't far behind. He had to act fast. "We need to leave," Jake said after a moment, his voice low. "But we need to be careful." Emily looked up at him, her face filled with a mix of confusion and fear. "Where are we going?" she asked. Jake stood up, grabbing his jacket. "We're getting you out of here," he said. "We'll figure this out." He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't waste any more time. He wasn't just going to sit back and hope things worked out. He was going to find the people who hurt her. He was going to make them pay. The day ahead was filled with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. Jake wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when Emily needed him. The ride out of the small motel was quiet, save for the sound of the Harley's engine rumbling beneath Jake. Emily sat behind him, her small hands gripping the back of his jacket, her body pressed against his. Despite the warmth of her body against his, Jake couldn't shake the cold feeling that settled in his gut. They were on the move now, but the threat still loomed over them. Whoever had hurt her was still out there, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The snow had slowed to a gentle fall, and the streets were mostly empty as they rode through the small town. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, just a quiet little town where the days bled into each other. But Jake knew better than to think he was safe here. His years on the road had taught him that trouble could show up anywhere. Emily's quiet presence behind him made the air feel heavier. He could sense her fear, even though she wasn't saying much. It wasn't the fear of someone who had been hurt. It was the fear of someone who had seen too much. Jake had a feeling she wasn't telling him everything, but he wasn't going to force it out of her. He had his own demons to face, and he knew better than to push someone who was already broken. As they made their way to the outskirts of town, Jake spotted the old warehouse up ahead. It was a large, dilapidated building, tucked away from the main road, its windows covered in grime, and its metal door rusted from years of neglect. Jake pulled up in front of it, his mind already working. He had a feeling this place might hold the answers he was looking for, but it was also dangerous. "Stay close," Jake said, turning his head slightly to make sure Emily heard him. She nodded, though he could see the hesitation in her eyes. "It's going to be okay," Jake added, even though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He parked the bike and dismounted, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The warehouse was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. He looked down at Emily, who was already off the bike, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She was more alert than he expected. "We need to be quick," Jake said. He led her towards the entrance, keeping his movements as quiet as possible. The door creaked open with a loud groan, and they slipped inside. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of street lamps outside. The smell of mildew and old machinery hit them immediately. Jake's eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light as he made his way further inside. He knew this place. He had been here before, back when his life was different, when the Brotherhood still meant something to him. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him as he moved through the dusty space, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Emily followed closely behind, her footsteps soft but determined. "Do you know who's been after you?" Jake asked, his voice low as they moved deeper into the warehouse. Emily shook her head, her face a mix of confusion and fear. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know who they are." Jake paused, his gaze scanning the shadows. "I've got a feeling we're about to find out," he said, his voice cold. He motioned for Emily to stay back as he approached a set of large metal crates stacked against the wall. He crouched down and carefully pried one open, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found exactly what he was expecting, stacks of old paperwork and several large duffel bags. The paperwork was all business, but it wasn't the kind of business Jake wanted to be involved in. He flipped through the papers quickly, his eyes catching words like payment and delivery. This was all tied to something bigger than just Emily. She was caught up in a web of crime that was bigger than anything he could have imagined. He quickly closed the crate and stood up, turning to face her. "We've got to go," Jake said. Now. They didn't have time to waste. Whatever was going on here, it was bad, and he wasn't going to let Emily get caught up in it. As they made their way back towards the door, a sound stopped them in their tracks. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Someone was coming. Jake motioned for Emily to stay behind him. "Don't move," he said, his voice tense. He could hear the person getting closer, their footsteps echoing through the empty warehouse. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. They couldn't stay here, not with whoever was coming. But Emily was frozen, her fear palpable in the air. Jake took a deep breath and slowly stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. Whoever was coming wasn't going to catch him off guard. Not this time. The footsteps grew louder, and Jake could see the faint outline of a figure in the shadows. "Get down," Jake hissed, pushing Emily behind a pile of crates. She stumbled, but managed to stay quiet. Jake's heart was hammering in his chest as he slowly crept towards the figure. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. Jake's instincts told him this wasn't someone who was here for a friendly chat. The man stopped a few feet away from Jake, unaware of his presence. Jake tightened his grip on his knife, ready to strike. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. Jake waited, his breath held, as the man in the shadows slowly turned, his footsteps stopping just a few feet away from where Jake was crouched. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on the knife. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to strike if needed. The man was unaware of Jake's presence, his back to him as he peered through the darkness of the warehouse. This was the moment. Jake's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the knife's handle, preparing for the first move. Just as he was about to step forward, Emily's voice broke the silence. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake froze, his body stiffening as he turned to see her standing behind him. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them, something desperate. "Please don't hurt him," she said softly, her words hanging in the air. Jake's heart sank. He wasn't sure who this man was, but if Emily recognized him, he had to trust her. The man's head snapped toward them at the sound of her voice, his dark eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Jake's hand was still on the knife, but his posture shifted slightly. He wasn't sure what to do. The man took a step forward, his gaze still focused on Emily, but there was something about him that made Jake hesitate. "She's with you?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Emily nodded, her eyes flickering nervously between the man and Jake. "She's with me," Jake replied, his voice steady but cautious. The man didn't move for a moment, his eyes studying both of them. Jake could feel the tension building again, but he didn't make a move. If this man was a threat, he would have to be dealt with quickly, but if Emily knew him, he had to tread carefully. The man let out a soft, almost amused grunt before taking another step forward. "I didn't think you'd show up like this," he said, his voice a little less hostile now. "Thought you'd be smarter than to come back here." Jake's brow furrowed. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. The man smirked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I'm the one who's been looking for her," he said, his gaze flickering to Emily. "And you're the one who's been running interference." Jake didn't know who this guy was, but the words made his blood run cold. Someone had been after Emily. Someone who was willing to do whatever it took to find her. Jake took a step forward, his voice hardening. "You're going to stay away from her," he said. The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't back down. "You think you can just come in here and take her from me?" he asked, his tone challenging. Jake's grip tightened on the knife, but he didn't raise it. He wasn't here to start a fight. He was here to protect Emily. "If you want her, you're going to have to go through me," Jake said, his voice cold. The man paused for a moment, his eyes flicking between Jake and Emily. "This doesn't have to be a fight," he said, his voice almost coaxing. "But if you're going to get in my way, then you're making a mistake." Jake knew there was something off about this guy. He didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but Emily's safety was his priority. "I don't care what you think," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm not letting you hurt her." The man took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his tone sharp. "But you're not going to be able to keep her safe forever. People like me always get what we want." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Not this time," he said. The man didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. This wasn't over. The man turned and began walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Jake's heart was still, racing as he watched him go, but he didn't lower the knife. He couldn't relax just yet. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Who was he?" she asked softly. Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure who the man was, but he could tell from the way he'd spoken that he was dangerous. Whoever was behind this, whoever wanted Emily, wasn't going to stop. And Jake wasn't going to stop either. He turned to Emily, his voice steady. "He's not going to hurt you," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure of that. Not yet. They needed to leave. Jake quickly grabbed her hand, leading her toward the exit of the warehouse. The sound of the man's footsteps faded into the distance, but Jake's mind was still racing. There was more to this than Emily knew, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not now. Not ever. Jake kept his eyes on the shadows as they moved quickly through the warehouse. Every step felt like they were getting deeper into something much darker than they anticipated. Emily was right behind him, her small footsteps barely audible, but the air was thick with tension. He didn't know how much longer they could stay ahead of whoever was chasing them. He kept his pace steady, leading her through the back exit of the warehouse. The cold night air hit him like a slap to the face as they stepped outside. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The sound of his boots crunching on the snow was the only thing that filled the silence as they moved toward the motorcycle. Jake felt the weight of every moment pressing on him. The man in the warehouse had made it clear that they were being watched, and whoever he was, Jake knew they wouldn't stop. He needed a plan, something that would keep Emily safe, something that would make sure they weren't caught off guard again. He helped Emily onto the bike, his movements quick but deliberate. "Hold on," he told her, giving her a quick glance before starting the engine. The bike roared to life beneath them, cutting through the stillness of the night. Emily clung to him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Her presence behind him was a reminder of everything he had to protect now. As they sped down the snow-covered streets, Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let his guard down, not with Emily in the back and with whoever was hunting them just around the corner. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, making sure no one was following. He didn't know where to go, but he knew they couldn't stay here. His thoughts were interrupted when a sharp, distant noise caught his attention. Tires screeching, the unmistakable sound of a car slamming on the brakes. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Someone was following them. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, shining bright enough to catch in the rearview mirror. "Hold on tight," Jake shouted, pushing the bike to its limits as he sped through the narrow streets, trying to lose their pursuers. Emily's grip tightened around him as they rounded the corner, the bike swerving to avoid a snowbank. The car wasn't far behind, its engine growling as it closed the gap. Jake's knuckles were white against the handlebars as he pushed the bike even faster, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He couldn't outrun them forever. He needed to find a way to shake them off. The sound of the car getting closer made the pressure in his chest rise. He had to think. He had to act. As they approached a small bridge, Jake made a sharp turn, taking them down an unpaved side street. The tires of the car skidded on the icy road as it tried to follow. Jake cursed under his breath, but there was no turning back now. The only thing he could do was keep going, keep running. The road ahead was dark, the trees on either side of them casting long shadows in the moonlight. He could hear the car's engine still behind them, its headlights shining bright in his rearview mirror. They were closing in fast. "Jake, what do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer right away. He needed a plan, and fast. As they reached a clearing, Jake saw an old barn in the distance. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance. "There!" Jake yelled, pointing toward the barn. "We're going there." He swerved the bike toward the barn, speeding across the open space. The tires slid on the frozen ground, but he kept the bike steady, his eyes fixed on the barn ahead. The car behind them was getting closer. Too close. Jake's heart raced. They were almost there. They reached the barn just as the car's headlights were almost upon them. With one final burst of speed, Jake pulled into the barn, the tires kicking up snow as they slid to a stop. He quickly shut off the engine, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here long, but they had to figure out what to do next. The car was still outside, its headlights shining through the cracks in the barn doors. "Get off," Jake said, helping Emily slide off the bike. They crouched low, moving into the shadows of the barn as quietly as possible. Emily's breathing was fast, but she didn't say anything. She knew as well as he did that the next few minutes could decide everything. They heard the car's doors slam shut, followed by footsteps. Jake's eyes flicked around the barn, looking for anything he could use. The barn was old, with piles of hay scattered around and rusted farming equipment against the walls. Not much for cover. He grabbed a rusty metal pipe from the ground and handed it to Emily. "Hold on to this," he said, his voice low. "Just in case." Emily took the pipe with shaky hands, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't used to this kind of danger, but Jake could see the strength in her. The footsteps outside stopped. Jake held his breath, waiting. He had no idea who was out there or how many of them there were, but he knew one thing. They weren't going to give up easily. Suddenly, the barn doors creaked open, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. Jake tensed, gripping the pipe tightly. It was go time. Jake's muscles were tense, every nerve in his body alert as he crouched low in the shadows, his hand gripping the metal pipe he had handed Emily. They were backed into a corner, the old barn offering little in terms of cover. He could hear the footsteps grow louder, the men outside methodically searching, and it was clear they were getting closer. Emily was beside him, her breath shallow, her grip on the pipe tight, but she didn't make a sound. She was scared, but there was something about the way she held herself that made Jake believe she could handle this. His mind raced. They didn't have a plan for this. The flashlight beam swept the barn, its harsh light cutting through the cracks in the wooden walls. Jake held his breath, waiting for the moment when the light would pass over them. Every instinct told him to move, to get Emily out of there, but they were cornered. He couldn't risk being seen. He could hear the man's voice, low and gravelly, as he barked orders to the others. Search the whole place. The kid's gotta be around here somewhere. Jake's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the word kid. This wasn't just about him or the trouble he had gotten into. It was about Emily. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. The footsteps stopped just outside their hiding spot, and Jake froze. The silence was deafening. The man outside seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if he was sensing something off about the barn. Then, without warning, the door creaked open slightly more, and a flashlight beam swung inside. Jake's mind worked in overdrive. He had to do something before they were found. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had no idea how many men were out there or how long they would keep looking, but they couldn't stay here much longer. The flashlight paused, its beam resting on a stack of hay bales just a few feet from where they were hiding. Jake could hear Emily's breathing pick up. She was frightened, but she stayed silent. He had to make a decision, and fast. He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. Without a word, he silently motioned for her to stay down. Then slowly, quietly, he began to move. The door creaked again, and Jake seized the opportunity. With a quick, controlled motion, he lunged from the shadows, pulling Emily with him. They bolted toward the far corner of the barn, where an old window was half open. Jake could hear the men behind them shouting now, but he didn't look back. There was no time. They had to move. Emily stumbled slightly, but Jake kept a firm grip on her as they reached the window. He pushed it open, the metal frame scraping against the wood, and motioned for Emily to climb through. She hesitated for just a moment, then nodded, sliding through the window. Jake followed right after, pulling himself through. With a grunt, they were outside now, in the freezing cold air, but it was their only chance. Jake scanned their surroundings quickly, making sure no one had seen them. The barn was still in the distance, the men inside likely scrambling to figure out where they had gone. He turned to Emily, who was shaking from the cold, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to keep moving," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Stick close." He led her away from the barn, heading towards the thick trees that bordered the property. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they moved, each step feeling heavier than the last. Jake's mind raced with plans and strategies, but the only thing he could focus on was getting Emily out of here. As they made their way deeper into the woods, the sound of the men's voices faded behind them. Jake's muscles were aching, but he didn't stop. They had to keep going, keep moving. The cold was biting, and the wind cut through his jacket, but he didn't let it slow him down. They reached the edge of the woods, and Jake glanced over at Emily, her face pale, her lips trembling from the cold. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice more urgent now. Emily nodded, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes. They were both running on fumes, and the night was only getting colder. Just as they began to move forward, a sharp noise echoed through the trees. Jake froze, his heart racing. It was the sound of tires, a vehicle approaching. His instincts told him to hide, but they had no cover here. "We have to go," Jake said urgently, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her along. The vehicle was getting closer, and Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. They were being hunted, and he wasn't about to let them catch up to Emily. They dashed towards a small outbuilding, barely visible through the trees. It was old and worn down, but it would have to do. Jake pushed open the creaking door, ushering Emily inside. They ducked low, staying as silent as possible. Jake's eyes darted around the room. There was no way to know if the men would find them here, but they couldn't take any chances. The sound of the vehicle grew louder, and Jake held his breath. The door to the outbuilding was barely shut, but it would have to hold for now. Emily pressed close to him, her small body shaking in the cold. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to keep her warm. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her, not while he still had a breath left in him. The vehicle came to a stop outside the building, and Jake's pulse raced. He looked down at Emily, her eyes filled with fear, but also trust. She was holding on to him with everything she had. And in that moment, Jake made a silent promise. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. The vehicle outside was silent now, and Jake dared not breathe too loudly. He could feel Emily's small body trembling against his as they huddled in the corner of the decrepit outbuilding. The wind howled outside, but inside the building, the cold was suffocating. The shadows were deep, and the only light came from the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the old walls. Every sound felt amplified in the quiet. Jake listened intently, trying to hear if the men had followed them in. His mind was racing, trying to anticipate their next move. The vehicle had stopped just outside, but there was no sound of footsteps, yet. That didn't mean they weren't coming. His instincts were screaming at him to stay still, to stay quiet. He didn't know how many men were out there or if they had dogs, but he couldn't risk being found now. His grip tightened around Emily's small hand as he whispered, "Stay close, don't make a sound." Emily nodded silently, her face pale in the dim light. Her fear was evident, but she was holding it together. Jake was proud of her, even though she was just a kid. She had been through more than anyone should have to endure. But they weren't out of danger yet. They had to keep moving, keep running. They had no choice. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the door. Slowly, they got louder, closer. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and he instinctively reached for the knife tucked inside his jacket. He couldn't see anything through the cracks in the walls, but he could feel the presence of the men, like a dark cloud closing in on them. He needed a way out, but the building was surrounded by trees and open ground. There was no easy escape. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Jake held his breath, praying they wouldn't come inside. Time seemed to stretch on forever, the silence so thick it felt like it could swallow them whole. Then, the door creaked. It was barely audible, but to Jake, it sounded like a gunshot. His eyes darted to the window, trying to see if anyone had noticed them, but the barn remained still. No one had entered. For a moment, it seemed like they were safe. But then a voice broke the silence. It was deep and gruff, but it carried a menacing undertone. "I know you're in there." The voice called out, rough with authority. Jake froze. The man outside had to be one of the ones who had been looking for them. The words cut through the air, each one laced with threat. He could feel his pulse racing in his throat. He glanced at Emily, who was staring at him, wide-eyed, her small hand squeezing his tightly. She had heard the man too. Jake didn't know if the man had seen them slip inside or if he was just guessing, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He whispered to Emily, "Stay low. Do exactly as I say. Don't move until I tell you." Emily nodded without a word, her eyes locked on his. She was listening to him. She trusted him, and that meant everything. Jake stood motionless, his back pressed against the wall, the knife clenched tightly in his hand. The man outside didn't seem to be moving. He was probably just waiting for them to make a mistake. Jake's thoughts raced, trying to come up with a plan. He couldn't fight all of them, and he couldn't risk Emily getting hurt. He had to think. His eyes flickered to the window. There was a slight gap in the boards where the light from the moon streamed through. He could just make out the silhouette of the man standing outside, his face partially obscured by shadows. He couldn't see what the man was holding, but Jake's instincts told him it was a weapon. The man was waiting for them to show themselves. And Jake was done waiting. He silently made his way to the side of the building, motioning for Emily to follow. They had to get out. They couldn't stay here. With a quick glance at the door, Jake moved toward the back of the building. The snow outside had turned into a heavy storm, but it might offer them some cover. As they reached the rear exit, Jake slowly opened the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The cold hit them like a wall as they stepped outside. The wind howled, and the snow whipped around them. The storm was their ally now. Jake could barely see through the blinding snow, but he knew the direction they needed to go. "Stay close," he whispered to Emily, his voice barely audible over the wind. She nodded, and they began to move quickly, slipping into the tree line. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but Jake didn't trust the silence. The men outside were still out there, still hunting them. As they ran through the snow, Jake's mind was calculating their next steps. They couldn't stay in the woods long. They needed shelter, warmth, and most importantly, they needed to put distance between themselves and the men chasing them. They pushed forward through the storm, Emily staying close, her face pale from the cold but determined. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for any sign of danger. They couldn't afford to stop. The storm seemed endless, the snow getting heavier with each passing minute. But they kept moving. And no matter what, Jake wasn't going to let them get caught. Not today. Not ever again. Jake's breath came out in heavy clouds as the storm intensified around them, the snow now falling in thick sheets. The wind whipped through the trees, cutting through their clothes and stinging their skin. He could barely make out the shape of the trees ahead of them, but he kept moving, his grip tight on Emily's hand. The girl was struggling to keep up, her small frame barely able to push through the deep snow, but she was doing her best. She was strong, stronger than Jake had expected. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the stormy night. The sound of their pursuers was gone, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they found them again. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Are you all right? Jake asked, his voice low, but full of concern. Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. I'm okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Jake felt a pang of guilt. She shouldn't have to be out here in the cold, running from people who wanted to hurt her. He had promised to protect her, but the storm, the dark woods, the unknown ahead, it all felt too much. Still, he pushed forward. They had no choice. As they trudged through the snow, Jake's thoughts raced. He needed to find shelter, somewhere they could hide and regroup. But the storm was relentless, and he couldn't see any clear path forward. He glanced around, hoping to spot something, anything, that could offer them shelter. In the distance, through the swirling snow, he saw it. A small cabin, barely visible through the trees. That way, Jake said, his voice cutting through the wind as he pointed towards the cabin. Emily nodded, her eyes brightening with the thought of warmth and safety. They pushed through the snow toward the cabin, each step more exhausting than the last. As they reached the door, Jake tried the handle, his heart sinking when it didn't budge. Locked. We don't have time for this, he muttered, and with a swift motion, he kicked the door with all his strength. The wood splintered under the force, and the door gave way with a loud crack. They stumbled inside, and Jake quickly shut the door behind them, breathing a sigh of relief. The cabin was small, the air inside musty and cold, but it was shelter. Jake helped Emily over to the far corner, where a dusty old couch sat against the wall. Sit here. I'll check around, Jake said, his voice more urgent now. Emily nodded and sank onto the couch, her face tired and worn. Jake moved quickly through the cabin, checking every corner. The place looked abandoned, with cobwebs in the corners and a thick layer of dust on the furniture. But it was secure. For now, it would have to do. He pulled a few blankets from a pile in the corner and draped them over Emily, making sure she was as warm as possible. You need to rest, he said, his voice softer now. Emily glanced up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and something else, something Jake couldn't quite place. You're not leaving me, are you? She asked her. Voice small. Jake hesitated for a moment. He hadn't thought about it like that, but the truth was, he wasn't leaving her. He couldn't. I'm not going anywhere, he said, sitting down beside her on the couch. Emily didn't say anything more. She simply leaned against him, exhausted from the night's ordeal. The warmth of the cabin was slowly seeping into her small body, and Jake could feel her relax against him. He didn't know how long they could stay here, but for now, this was all they had. He rested his head against the wall, his eyes closed for a moment, letting the silence of the cabin wrap around them. But his mind wouldn't stop. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was coming for them. Whoever had been after Emily wasn't going to let up. Jake knew that now. And the worst part was, he had no idea who was behind it all or what they wanted. All he knew was that they were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He would protect Emily at all costs. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her again. But as the night wore on, Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the man he had seen in the warehouse. The man who had been hunting Emily. There was something about him that made Jake uneasy. He wasn't just some random thug. He had a purpose, and that purpose was Emily. Jake knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now, they were safe. At least, for tonight. We'll figure it out tomorrow, Jake whispered, more to himself than to Emily. He glanced down at the girl, her small body curled against him, sound asleep. He watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't deserve this. But Jake would do everything in his power to make sure she was safe. And when the time came, when the storm was over, he would make sure they paid for what they had done. The cold morning light filtered through the cracks in the cabin, waking Jake from the restless sleep that had plagued him all night. The storm outside had died down, but the weight of their situation was heavier than ever. He sat up slowly, trying not to disturb Emily, who was still asleep, curled up under the blankets. Her breathing was steady now, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before the nightmares started again. She had been through too much. He looked around the small cabin, taking in the bare surroundings. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. He had to focus on keeping her safe, keeping them both alive. His eyes moved to the window. He could see the remnants of the storm. Snow piled high against the trees, the ground still slick with ice. There was no sign of the men who had been chasing them. Not yet. But Jake knew better than to think they were in the clear. He had seen the look in the man's eyes, the way he spoke. He was just one of many, and they wouldn't stop. The question was, who were they working for? Jake ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on him. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Emily stirred beside him, her small body shifting under the covers. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, her gaze met his. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her face. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He wished he could take it all away. "You okay?" Jake asked softly, his voice low so as not to disturb the fragile peace between them. Emily nodded, but the tightness around her eyes told him everything. She wasn't okay, but she wasn't alone. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. He stood up and stretched, his joints stiff from the cold, and walked over to the small stove in the corner. He started a fire, the crackling warmth slowly filling the room. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Emily sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake paused, turning to look at her. "Sorry for what?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "For putting you in danger." Jake shook his head, walking over to her. He kneeled down in front of her, lifting her chin so she had to look him in the eye. "You didn't put me in danger. We're in this together. You don't have to apologize for anything." Emily's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, Jake thought she was going to break down. But instead, she wiped her eyes quickly and nodded. "I just don't want to be a burden." Jake's heart tightened at the words. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the burden she carried from everything she had been through. "You're not a burden, Emily," Jake said firmly. "You're not alone in this. And I'm not going anywhere. I promise." She gave him a small, tentative smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Jake stood and walked back to the window, scanning the outside once again. He could still hear the wind howling through the trees, but there were no signs of anyone else. For now, they were safe. But that wasn't going to last. He needed to figure out their next move. "We need to get out of here," Jake said after a long pause. Emily looked up at him, confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean? We can't stay here. It's too dangerous. We need to keep moving, stay ahead of whoever is looking for us." He turned away from the window and faced her. "I don't know where we're going yet, but we'll figure it out." Emily nodded, though she still seemed uncertain. She wasn't used to running, to always being on the move. She had been through too much already. But Jake knew they didn't have a choice. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. He walked over to the pile of supplies he had gathered the night before, mostly food and water, but not enough to last long. They needed to get to a town, someplace where they could lay low for a while. "We'll head for the highway," Jake said, his mind already working through their options. "From there, we'll figure out where to go next. But we can't stay here." Emily didn't say anything, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes again. She was scared. She didn't want to keep running. But she didn't have a choice either. Neither of them did. Jake walked over to the door and opened it, the cold air rushing in. The storm had cleared, but the world outside was still covered in a thick blanket of snow. He turned back to Emily, offering her his hand. "Ready?" She hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. She didn't speak, but Jake could feel her small hand shaking in his. "We'll get through this," he whispered. Together, they stepped outside into the cold, the snow crunching under their feet. Jake glanced back at the cabin one last time before they began walking toward the highway. They didn't know where the road would take them, but Jake would keep going, no matter what. He wasn't about to let Emily down. Not now. Not ever. Jake's footsteps were steady but quick as he led Emily down the narrow path that led to the highway. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still howled through the trees, carrying with it the sting of cold. Emily was right behind him, her small body bundled in the thick jacket he had found for her in the cabin. She was silent, the weight of their situation pressing down on both of them. The sound of their boots crunching in the snow was the only noise between them, and Jake could feel the tension growing with every step. The highway was still miles away, but he knew they had to make it there. The closer they got to civilization, the more they would blend in, the more they could find help. The further they got from the cabin, the safer they would be. Jake glanced over his shoulder at Emily. She was walking slower now, her head down, eyes on the ground. He could see the exhaustion in her movements, the way she shivered even beneath the layers of clothing she was wearing. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to running. "Hey," Jake said, his voice softer than usual. Emily looked up at him, her expression tired but still hopeful. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but Jake could tell she was still scared. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't believe her, but he didn't press the issue. They didn't have time for that right now. He could see the highway in the distance now, just a faint line on the horizon. The path they were on was winding, cutting through the woods, but it would eventually lead them to the road. "We'll be there soon," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He glanced around, trying to keep an eye out for any signs of danger. He didn't trust the men who were after them. He didn't trust that they wouldn't show up at any moment. But for now, there was nothing. The woods were quiet, the only sound the wind and their footsteps. The road seemed far off, but Jake pushed on, trying to keep his focus. As they reached the edge of the woods, the ground turned into a clearing, and Jake felt the tension in his body ease just a little. The highway was only a short walk away now, and with it, they would have a chance at safety. "Almost there," Jake said, looking over at Emily. She didn't respond, but he could see the determination in her eyes. They both knew they had to keep going, no matter what. But then, just as they were about to step onto the open road, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. A noise. A car engine. The sound of tires crunching through the snow. His heart stopped for a moment, and he grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her into the cover of the trees. They crouched low, Jake's heart racing as he scanned the road. The car was getting closer. He couldn't tell who it was, but the engine sounded familiar. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it someone looking for them? Someone from the cabin? Or was it just a random passerby? They couldn't afford to take chances. He pulled Emily closer, his grip firm on her arm. "Stay down," he whispered. They waited in the cold silence, the only sound the car getting closer. Jake's eyes were fixed on the road, his mind running through every possibility. The car slowed as it approached, the headlights cutting through the darkness. It was a black SUV, the kind that was used by people who didn't want to be seen. The vehicle stopped just a few yards down the road, and Jake's stomach twisted. He couldn't see the driver's face, but the feeling in his gut told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a coincidence. The car was here for them. "Get ready," Jake whispered, his voice low. He could feel Emily's small hand trembling in his, but she didn't make a sound. She trusted him. Jake had to act fast. They couldn't stay here, not with the car so close. He looked around, trying to find a way out, but the trees were dense, and the car had them cornered. There was only one way out. He pulled Emily along with him, his hands still tight around hers, and moved further into the trees. The car door slammed. The sound of footsteps on the snow was unmistakable. They were getting closer. Jake pushed Emily forward, his mind racing. "Keep going," he urged her. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they didn't have much time. They couldn't outrun the men, but he had to try. He pushed Emily ahead, urging her to move faster. They broke through the trees, into the open space near the road. Jake glanced behind him. The men were almost there. They were closing in fast. Without thinking, Jake grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her into a small alleyway between two buildings. They crouched down, trying to stay out of sight. The footsteps were getting closer, and Jake's heart was racing in his chest. He didn't know how much longer they could hide. But for now, they were safe. Just a little longer. The footsteps grew louder, the sound of heavy boots crunching through the snow echoing in the narrow alley. Jake's pulse was racing as he crouched low, pulling Emily closer to him. He could feel her body trembling against his, and though she was trying to stay quiet, he could hear her shallow breaths. They were so close. The men were almost there. Jake's mind raced as he searched for a way out. There was no time to think. No time for a plan. They couldn't stay hidden much longer. The alleyway was small, the buildings around them towering like silent sentinels, but they offered little protection. The men were coming, and Jake could feel it. The inevitable confrontation was fast approaching. His grip on Emily's hand tightened. He had to move. He had to protect her. He could hear the men's voices now, low and urgent, as they neared the alley. Jake glanced to the side. A fire escape ladder hung loosely from one of the buildings, but it was too high up for Emily to reach. He couldn't climb it fast enough to make it work. There was no other option. He turned to Emily, his face inches from hers, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay behind me, no matter what happens." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't speak. She trusted him. She had to. The sound of boots scraping against the concrete grew louder, and Jake knew that time was running out. He could hear them just on the other side of the alley now, and there was no way to escape without being seen. He had no choice. He had to face them. Jake stood up slowly, his body tense, his hand resting on the knife in his jacket. He wasn't here to fight, but he would if he had to. His eyes scanned the men emerging from the alley, their faces cold and expressionless. There were 3 of them, too many to take on head-to-head, but Jake wasn't backing down. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward first, his eyes narrowing as he saw Jake. "We know you're here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Jake didn't say anything at first. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing he was afraid. He just stood there, his posture defiant, the knife still hidden in his jacket. He wasn't going to make the first move. The scarred man looked over at the others, a silent command passing between them. One of them, a shorter man with a shaved head, reached for his weapon. Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of these men, not anymore. The scarred man's eyes shifted back to Jake. "We're not here to kill you," he said, his tone almost calm, as if the threat was just part of the game. "But you've made a big mistake, crossing us. You're in way over your head, friend." Jake's mind was running through every scenario, but his focus was on Emily, standing just behind him. She was still, her eyes wide with fear, but she wasn't crying. She was waiting, watching. "This ends now," Jake said, his voice steady, though his fists were clenched. "You stay away from her." The scarred man's lip curled into a smirk, clearly amused. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, stepping forward, closing the distance. Jake's hand moved to his knife, ready to defend, but just as he took a step back, Emily moved in front of him. Her small frame stood between the men and Jake, her face determined. "Please," she said, her voice shaking, but strong. "Just leave us alone. We're not what you want." The men stopped, their eyes flicking to Emily. The scarred man looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "You really think we're here for you?" he said slowly. "No, we're here for him." He pointed at Jake. "But you've gotten in the way, so now you're just as much a problem." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let Emily get caught up in this. He couldn't let these men hurt her. He took a step forward, his voice low but steady. "I won't let you hurt her. You want me? Come at me, but leave her out of this." The scarred man's eyes flickered with something dark, a hint of anger rising. "You're stubborn. I like that," he said, his voice taking on a colder edge. "But this isn't going to end well for you. For either of you." Jake stood his ground. He wasn't going to back down. He had to protect Emily at all costs. He could feel the tension in the air, thick as fog, as the men seemed to size him up. The other 2 men were still standing back, watching, waiting for a signal. The scarred man raised his hand, signaling them to hold. The standoff lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Jake's eyes never left the man in front of him. Emily was still behind him, her small hand gripping his jacket, but she didn't move. She didn't make a sound. Jake could feel her trust in him, and that gave him the strength to stand tall. "We're leaving," Jake said firmly, stepping to the side and blocking their path. "You're not touching her. Not today. Not ever." The scarred man studied him for a moment, his eyes cold. Then, as if weighing the situation, he gave a curt nod. "This isn't over," he warned. "You're still in our sights. Don't think we won't come after you." Without another word, the men turned and began to walk away, their footsteps fading into the night. Jake's breath escaped in a rush, his body still tense with adrenaline. He didn't relax until he was sure they were gone, until their presence had disappeared into the distance. Only then did he allow himself to turn to Emily. She was still standing behind him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, but the fear was still there. It was never going to be easy, but they were still alive. For now, that was all that mattered. Jake stood there, his chest still heaving, watching the men disappear into the night. His fingers were tight around the handle of his knife, but the threat had passed for now. The weight of the situation still hung heavily in the air. They had escaped, barely. The storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. Jake turned slowly, his eyes falling on Emily. She stood there, still a few feet away, her small figure dwarfed by the darkness around her. She looked at him, her eyes wide, filled with the kind of fear no child should ever have to know. But there was something else in her eyes too. Something Jake hadn't seen in her before. A flicker of hope. A spark that had been buried under the weight of everything she had endured. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he couldn't stop fighting. He had promised to protect her, and that promise meant everything. He walked over to her, his boots crunching in the snow as he closed the distance. She didn't move, but when he reached her, she finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Are they gone?" Jake nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, for now." He studied her face for a moment. "You're safe, Emily. I won't let anything happen to you." She looked up at him, her small hand still gripping the edge of his jacket. Her words were barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Jake. I don't know what to do." Jake crouched down in front of her, looking her in the eyes. He could see the weight of the world in her gaze, but he refused to let her fall. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice firm. "I'm right here with you, and we'll keep going, no matter what." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing his words. The fear was still there, but Jake could see a shift in her. She was trying to be strong, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake believed her. He stood up and glanced around, taking in their surroundings. The storm had cleared, but the world was still cold, unforgiving. They were far from safety, but at least they were alive. And that was a start. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice more resolute now. "We can't stay here. Not yet." Emily nodded again, though her small frame seemed exhausted from the night's ordeal. Jake could feel it too. His body ached from the tension of running, from the constant adrenaline that had kept him on edge for so long. But they couldn't rest yet. They couldn't afford to. They needed to find shelter. They needed to find a place where they could lay low, figure out their next move. Jake looked out toward the horizon, scanning the distance for any signs of danger. But all he saw were trees, snow, and the stillness of the night. They were alone for now. Alone, but not safe. "Let's head toward the town," Jake said, turning to face Emily. "We'll find a place to stay, and we'll figure this out from there." Emily looked up at him, her face tired but still holding on to the faintest trace of hope. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't know. He didn't have all the answers. But he had something more important than answers. He had resolve. He wasn't going to let her down. "We'll be okay," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure of it." With that, they started walking again, heading toward the town in the distance. Jake kept a close eye on Emily as they moved. She was quieter now, but there was something in the way she walked, in the way she held her head, that told him she was stronger than she looked. She was ready to face whatever came next. And so was he. They walked in silence, the cold air biting at their skin, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Jake kept his thoughts on the road ahead, trying to shut out the noise in his head. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. Not now. Not when they had a chance to start over. The world had thrown everything it had at Emily, and now it was throwing it all at him too. But Jake wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He would fight, not just for himself, but for her. He would protect her, no matter the cost. Because that's what he had promised. The night stretched on, the darkness pressing in around them, but Jake didn't feel the weight of it. Not as long as they were together. And when they reached the town, when they found shelter and safety, they would figure out their next move. They would keep moving forward, one step at a time, because that's all they could do. And together, they would survive. I have just finished a thrilling chapter in one of the most gripping Hell Angels stories, following the journey of a biker and a young girl on the run from dangerous enemies. After narrowly escaping a life-threatening situation, the two protagonists find themselves running through the woods, always looking over their shoulders, trying to stay one step ahead of the men who relentlessly pursue them. The stormy night is their only cover as they seek shelter in a small, abandoned cabin, but danger is never far behind. As the night stretches on, the stakes rise higher in these Hell Angel stories. The biker's determination to protect the girl leads to high-stakes encounters, tense moments of hiding, and a struggle to survive against the odds. As they continue to fight for their lives, they realize that their enemies won't stop until they have what they want. These Hell Angel stories are filled with suspense, unexpected twists, and heart-pounding moments that will keep you on the edge of your seat. With each turn, the biker and the girl grow closer to finding the safety they so desperately need, but at what cost? The deep bond between them becomes even more evident as they face the darkness and dangers ahead, proving the power of loyalty and strength in these Hell Angel stories. Get ready to be immersed in a world where survival is the only option, and the next step could change everything. Dive into these Hell Angel stories for an unforgettable ride through suspense, danger, and resilience.